The Ukraine war is the largest tank conflict since World War II. But how are Russia's tanks actually faring? And how are they really matching up against Ukraine's small but powerful collection of Western armor? It's been difficult to truly gauge the effectiveness of tanks from either side in the current conflict, but the staggering losses have many wondering if the age of the tank is well and truly over. Estimates vary, and given the fog of war and both sides' desire to weaponize information, a true tally is difficult to ascertain. Oryx, which only lists visually confirmed losses, lists Russia as having lost 3,235 tanks. This lines up with the Western estimates from earlier in the year that Russia had passed the 3,000 mark in lost main battle tanks. More tanks than it had operational when the invasion started. Ukraine, meanwhile, states that Russia has lost over 8,000 tanks. The truth is likely falling somewhere in between the Oryx and very conservative Western estimate and Ukraine's likely overly optimistic estimate. Ukraine, meanwhile, is estimated to have lost around 1,000 tanks, which tracks with Oryx's visually confirmed tally of 865 lost tanks and the fact that it has largely fought defensively for the duration of the war. The primary tank killer in Ukraine is anti-tank weapons and artillery. Western-supplied anti-tank missiles have proven crucial in blunting Russia's armored offensive, especially during the early stage of the war when Ukraine's tank forces were significantly outnumbered and under extreme air threat. With the propagation of Western air defense systems, the air threat has been significantly reduced, and Russia's tank-hunting helicopter fleet suffered catastrophic casualties in 2023 when it was thrown sacrificially at Ukrainian forces in desperate bids to stop a penetration of the front lines and from ATACMS strikes on their home airfields. These threats are not new to tanks, and in fact it was the use of Soviet-made Stagger anti-tank missiles in the Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors that first brought up the question of the continued usefulness of tanks. The wire-guided missile took a lot of training to master, but it allowed Egypt to deploy large numbers of tank-killing infantry that leveled the playing field against superior Israeli tanks and training, taking the IDF completely by surprise. An estimated 800 tanks and armored vehicles would fall prey to the Stagger, raising serious alarm bells in the West as they faced the prospect of facing the same weapon only on a much larger scale in a war in Europe. However, the IDF quickly found ways to counter the Stagger. Dust and smoke screens would make it difficult to target friendly tanks, as the Stagger was a wire-guided missile that required its operator to guide it to its target. Fusing artillery with tank assaults and laying down suppressive fire on enemy positions also disrupted effective use of the Stagger, as the operator had to keep the tank in sight for nearly the entire flight path of the missile. Infantry used in support of tank operations would be as critical then as it was during World War II, and in the end, the tank would survive the deadly threat posed by the Stagger and continue to remain relevant. In Ukraine, we're seeing apocalyptic tank casualties combined with the introduction of a completely new generation of anti-tank weapons, and new types altogether. Anti-tank missiles remain a deadly threat, deadlier than ever in fact, as modern anti-tank weapons don't require a user to stay locked onto the target. The famous American Javelin, for example, allows a shooter to designate a target and fire a missile and then hop back into cover, as the missile guides itself to the target. The weapon has been absolutely critical for Ukraine's defense, achieving the same effect as the Stagger in the early stages of the Yom Kippur War. Only Russia never adapted to the threat. Ukraine has received tens of thousands of Western anti-tank weapons, with 10,200 US Javelins alone. For its part, Russia too has used anti-tank weapons to great success. With its Kornet ATGN, also a fire-and-forget weapon, Kornet has proven a threat to any armored vehicle in the Ukrainian inventory, with performance comparable to the Javelin. The Kornet, however, is a two-man weapon system and can take up to a minute to set up and fire, where the Javelin is far more portable and faster to employ. Artillery also has been a significant threat to both sides' tank forces during the war. Tanks, even the mighty Abrams and Britain's Challenger, the two most well-armored tanks in the world, are not built to resist a direct hit by artillery. The greatest threat from artillery, however, comes in two different forms, the first being a mobility kill. Tank tracks cannot be armored, and the links that hold them together are a notorious weak point for all tanks. A close enough hit from an artillery shell might have no effect on the crew or the integrity of the tank, but be enough to damage or destroy the tracks. This leaves the tank stuck, at which point it becomes incredibly vulnerable to any other anti-tank weapon in the field, including other tanks. The second way in which artillery threatens tanks is the deployment of anti-tank mines via artillery shells. Both sides have used artillery to deploy impromptu anti-tank minefields in the face of advancing forces, but Ukraine has used the tactic to truly devastating effect against Russian forces. The Battle of Volodar during the winter of 2023 remains the largest tank battle of the war, with Russian forces suffering an estimated 60-plus tanks destroyed or captured. A key tactic utilized by Ukraine was the rapid deployment of minefields via U.S.-supplied anti-tank mine and artillery shells. The approaches to the city were all mined, and the Russians managed to identify select safe routes. The Ukrainians allowed the Russians to utilize those routes, with minefields often meters away on either side from the safe route of travel. Once contact was made, Ukrainian artillery would fire anti-tank mines behind the Russian forces before switching to regular shells and engaging the attacking force. In the panic and confusion, Russians attempting to retreat would run straight into the recently deployed minefields. But none of these threats are new, and up until the Ukraine war were all expected and accounted for in global military calculations when it came to the employment of tanks. One specific weapon, though, has turned the tank world on its head: the simple drone. Drones capable of launching anti-tank weapons aren't new. US-made Predator drones have been firing Hellfire missiles for over 2 decades at this point. What is new about drones is the development and the widespread availability of small, very fast, and agile drones that can be easily employed by infantry as makeshift precision-guided weapons. The US and other nations already had weaponized small drones, either in development or deployed. America's Switchblade family of drones has been used in Ukraine to great effect, both in the anti-personnel variant and the larger anti-tank variant. What is unprecedented in the Ukraine war, though, is the use of civilian drones as improvised weapons, with Ukrainians strapping anti-tank munitions directly to quadcopters that they use as self-destruct weapons. The drone may be what allowed Ukraine to hold the line in the early days of war, with the UAF adopting the mass use of drones at an unprecedented scale. The Russians were taken completely by surprise, and it's taken them 2 years to begin to match the Ukrainians in drone deployment. The threat posed by these weapons to tanks comes in 2 different forms. The first is the traditional anti-tank role. In this role, the drone is strapped with an anti-tank weapon of some sort, anything from an IED to an anti-tank shell jerry-rigged to detonate on impact with a tank. The drone is then flown directly at the enemy tank, using its extreme maneuverability to target in its most vulnerable areas: the top and the rear of the turret and the rear of the tank. This is where the armor is thinnest, as tanks cannot be equally armored everywhere or they'd be too heavy to move. Both sides have utilized drones in this manner to great success, and while there's no record of Russia having bested a Ukrainian Abrams in a tank-on-tank duel, we have a well-documented case of Russian drones being employed to first immobilize the tank by damaging the treads and then destroy it by striking the turret. The second method of employing drones is with incendiary or other types of grenades, and this is what makes drones such an insidious threat. These drones are not specifically made to be anti-tank weapons, as grenades wouldn't do much to scrape the paint, even on a Russian tank. However, they excel at flying behind the enemy's front lines to catch crews unaware, with many examples of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades into open hatches. Drones have even been utilized to deploy anti-tank mines directly in the path of Russian tanks along safe avenues of travel previously cleared. In one particularly notable example, a Ukrainian drone simply dropped its anti-tank mine directly on top of a parked Russian tank, destroying it completely. Gauging the effectiveness of Russian tanks in the face of these threats can be difficult for a variety of factors. First, no tank in service at the start of the Ukrainian war was optimized for drone defense. A new generation of active protection measures was being adopted by various Western militaries, with the US installing the Israeli-made Trophy system on its Abrams tanks. However, Trophy was optimized for defeating incoming projectiles such as RPGs and anti-tank missiles, though it could feasibly be used to defeat a suicide drone within a very specific engagement cone that leaves most of the tank unprotected for the airborne threat. To defeat incoming threats, Trophy and similar systems utilize radar to track the threat and engage it with explosively formed projectiles. In effect, it's like firing a shotgun shell at an incoming missile, causing significant if not catastrophic damage to the missile, or, like in the case of a rocket-propelled grenade, causing the armor-penetrating explosive jet to form prematurely away from the armor, significantly reducing its penetration. Drones, however, require a different approach, as most drones are already too slow for Trophy's electronic brain to register them as an incoming threat. Armies the world over are experimenting with everything from variants of a trophy-like active protection system to laser weapons, which the US plans to implement in future Abrams upgrades. None of these systems are currently available to Russia, which has forced them into seeking alternatives to protect their tanks. Of all the things Russia does poorly, electronic warfare has historically not been one of them, and many will acknowledge that Russia's EW capabilities are quite formidable, if not superior to Western armies. This has largely been out of necessity to counter the West's increased reliance on high-tech weapons and communication systems. EW assets have taken a significant toll on Ukraine's employment of both smart munitions and drones, interrupting GPS and communication signals. Of the 10,000 estimated drones a month that Ukraine loses to Russian defenses, most of these are defeated by electronic countermeasures. Russia's begun to equip its tanks with electronic warfare modules in an attempt to protect them from the drone threat. These have been coupled with the now infamous turtle tanks that have been surrounded by a protective outer shell typically made out of a combination of wood and sheet metal. The improvised armor might look ridiculous, but even Ukraine admits that it has been effective at frustrating their efforts to destroy Russian tanks with drones. The thin armor won't stop any anti-tank weapon, but it does cause them to detonate early and safely away from the armor. Turtle tanks are thus protected versus drones, but extremely vulnerable to traditional cannon fire from enemy tanks, given the fact that the added armor makes it impossible to traverse the turret very far in either direction and significantly limits situational awareness. The use of EW modules along with the turtle armor has varied in effectiveness, mostly dependent on the quality of the modules themselves. In some cases, it's been highly effective, but we also have video evidence of Ukrainian drones simply flying straight inside the turtle armor of a tank, unimpeded. What's important is that it's working to a degree, and so far it's been the best anti-drone tank protection that either side has fielded. However, this is unlikely to hold for much longer, as even now there's work to equip drones with artificial intelligence capable of targeting enemy tanks independent of a human operator. Thus, when EW interference cuts a drone operator off from his drone, the drone can still find and engage the target on its own. The static nature of the conflict also makes it difficult to truly gauge the effectiveness of Russian tanks. The Ukrainian war better resembles the trench warfare of World War I than the more mobile nature of the Second World War. But modern weapons make the use of tanks in a static conflict even more deadly than previous eras. Simply put, Russia's tank losses in this conflict are not themselves indicative of the quality of Russian tanks, as any tank army in the world fighting a similar conflict would experience similar casualties. Even the mighty Abrams and the Challengers would face apocalyptic loss rates in a conflict dominated by trenches and artillery. Matter of fact, Ukraine has used its few Abrams and Challengers as long-range guns rather than lead assaults because of this exact reason. What Russia's tanks are showing the world is that they have a very limited utility in a static conflict, with modern weapons posing far too deadly a threat when tank forces are employed in the manner we see in Ukraine. Thus, it's not specifically a matter of Russia's tanks being bad, but rather they're being used poorly. Modern tank doctrine emphasizes maneuver and combined arms warfare to make up for the vehicle's vulnerabilities to modern threats, both of which Russia is failing to employ. The static nature of the war is a casualty of poor Russian doctrine and its inability to wage a combined arms war, overwhelming enemy defenses with multi-layered threats and penetrating strikes into the rear. The combination of air power, missile, and artillery strikes should be employed to destroy air defenses, allowing further air power and missile strikes to then disrupt the enemy's rear and destroy its artillery. This leaves the defending infantry unsupported and vulnerable to armored assaults spearheaded by the tank. Russia doesn't do this, and when it was still trying, it didn't go well. Thus, while it's tempting to look at Russia's catastrophic tank losses as indicative of tank quality, it's an unfair comparison. It's not just poor doctrine, though, that's harming Russia's tank forces. It's also poor training. By any estimate, except a Russian one, Russia has lost in quantity the entire tank force that it had started the war with, pulling heavily from its vast Cold War reserves, which even now approach exhaustion. Here, though, is a key difference between Russian and Western tanks, and one that has spelled disaster for the armed forces of the Russian Federation. The T-90, Russia's most advanced tank, weighs in just shy of 50 tons. A modern Abrams weighs in at about 66 tons, if not more, while the latest variant of a Leopard 2 comes in at 62.5 tons, and the British Challenger at 66 tons. This is a staggering weight difference, the equivalent of Russia bringing a welterweight to a heavyweight championship bout. Offensively, all these tanks may be comparable, though Russian tanks have worse electronics. But all that extra weight Western tanks lug around comes in the form of armor and additional capabilities to increase survivability and lethality. The design differences come down to two completely different doctrines and heralds back to the Cold War. The Soviet Union had access to vast amounts of manpower across the Soviet bloc, its military dwarfing the size of Western allies. However, to equip all of those units, the Soviets had to rely on cheaper tanks that could be mass-produced, opting for quantity over quality. The West, meanwhile, realized that it had a significant numbers problem and thus opted to offset its disadvantage by investing heavily into technology and, most importantly, protection. The focus for the West was not just to out-tech Russian tanks, thus making each Western tank a match for 3 or 4 of its Soviet counterparts, but even more importantly, to ensure the crew survived the destruction of the tank. Crew survivability meant that they could put veteran combat personnel straight into a new tank and back into the fight, while the Soviets opted to colonize space by ensuring each of their tank crews got blown into orbit. The Soviet legacy translated to the modern Russian Federation and onto the battlefields of Ukraine. Despite Western tank losses, Ukrainian forces have noted that the greatest advantage Western tanks have provided its crew is survivability. Time and again, Ukrainian crews are able to safely exit their vehicles and get to safety, where they can be assigned to a new tank. This was on display with the Russian destruction of an American Abrams using drones. Not only did it take multiple drones to destroy the tank, but when the tank's ammo compartment was struck, which normally would be a fatal blow to a Russian tank, the compartmentalized ammo storage performed as designed, venting the explosive energy of the detonating rounds away from the crew compartment and out through the blowout panels on the turret of the tank. The Ukrainian crew lost the tank, but was able to safely evacuate. We've seen the results of poor Russian design decisions on display throughout the war in Ukraine, though its effects get more pronounced as the war drags on. Russian tank forces were already only moderately well trained at the start of the conflict, and that might be a generous estimation. As casualties mounted, though, Russia is increasingly throwing under-trained green crews into combat. On average, it can take an American or British tanker as much as 2 years to learn to properly fight in their tank. But Russia's pressing need to get crews into action means that as the war drags on and tank casualties mount, tank crews are increasingly less experienced and trained. This was best on display in a winter engagement between 2 American Bradley IFVs and a modern Russian T-90. The now viral video shows an American Bradley defeating a Russian T-90, its most modern and capable variant. However, the Bradley doesn't defeat the Russian tank in the way it destroyed so many Soviet tanks during the wars in Iraq. Rather, it did so in an extremely unconventional way that should never have been possible versus a well-trained crew. During the engagement, the tank crew fired first on a Bradley it was pursuing, missing both times as the Bradley put buildings and trees between itself and the Russian tank. This strongly hints at inexperience or poor training of the crew, and yet the tank would go on to miss several more times firing on the Ukrainian Bradleys. The second Bradley then switched to explosive ammunition for its 25mm cannon and began to hammer the turret of the T-90, destroying or damaging its various sensors and cameras used for situational awareness. It also appears that there was damage done to the turret as it began to spin out of control while the Russians fled the battlefield. The crew would end up abandoning their tank, which was later destroyed by a drone. The stunning victory should have in fact been a crushing defeat for both Bradleys, by the very vehicle designed to destroy them. Crew inexperience and poor training, however, is almost certainly to blame for the poor performance of the Russian tank. Russia's poor training does more to defeat its armored forces than each tank's capabilities, but this is a war they weren't designed to fight in. Russia's tanks, from the T-72 to the T-80 and the T-90, are all meant to be employed by a conscript force and in large numbers, maneuvering at divisional or corps levels. Instead, the fighting in Ukraine has mostly been at the company or even platoon level, where an individual tank commander's capabilities are far more important. Russian tank commanders are not up to the task of fighting dynamic conflicts and exhibit a high degree of decision paralysis due to a lack of initiative that lies at the core of Western military leadership training. All of this makes it difficult to accurately ascertain the capabilities of individual tank models employed in Ukraine, which range all the way from the ancient T-54 to the modern T-90, disregarding any Cold War-era tank older than the T-72. The T-72 alongside the T-80 and T-90 have performed on paper as designed. All 3 tanks have excellent mobility, even if the engines are underpowered compared to Western tanks. A similar lack of protection, though, leaves them all vulnerable to Western tanks. In one video, a Ukrainian Leopard 2 engages two Russian tanks, believed to either be T-72s or T-90s. The Leopard achieves a direct strike on one Russian tank, resulting in a large explosion. This is likely due to the use of a high explosive shell, which to its credit the Russian tank survives, albeit it's unknown what the state of the crew is and how many, if any, casualties were suffered. What is certain is that all of the tank's external sensors would have been damaged or destroyed, and the internal concussion would have taken a toll on the crew. At this point, the Russian tanks retreat, though it appears as if the Ukrainian Leopard also goes in reverse. This hints that the encounter was a surprise for both sides, as does the use of the HE shell. The Leopard was likely expecting to engage less well-armored Russian vehicles such as BMPs, but the video is indicative of three things. First is the crew's awareness and response, with the Leopard spotting, targeting, and firing first on the Russian tanks. This hints that either the Russians were completely unaware of their surroundings, or the Ukrainian crew was better trained and employing better electronics, able to resolve the threat faster. The first shot accuracy of the Leopard, even as it's on the move in retreat, is also a point in favor of the tank over the Russian T-72, T-80, and T-90, which, while able to hit targets on the move, are known to have reduced accuracy over their Western counterparts, especially the T-72. The Leopard exhibits high reverse speed, which is also a weakness of Russian tanks. A Leopard can reverse at 20 miles per hour, presenting its front armor to the enemy the entire time. Russia's latest T-90, however, has a reverse speed of between 2.5 miles per hour and a generous 9 miles an hour, depending on who you ask. This is in line with the T-72, which has a reverse speed of 2.5 miles per hour, although the T-80 is believed to reverse at up to 6.8 miles per hour. As the war is dragged on, Russia has relied heavily on its older T-72s over its more modern T-90s, which were late to join the conflict. By the measure of the most independent observers, the T-90 has underperformed even when compared to the T-72, despite the T-90 being far more modern. The T-90, for instance, features explosive reactive armor across the hull and turret, an anti-drone net, and a more powerful cannon than the T-72. Its electronics and firing computer are also more modern and capable. Despite this, slow reverse speed and weak armor right under the gun mantlet are some of the flaws of Russia's most modern tank. The weak mantlet armor has been compensated for with the use of a metal skirt around the turret, but it only protects against threats such as RPGs and not anti-tank missiles targeting the known weak spot. The tank's active protection system has also proven time and again to be ineffective against anti-tank missiles. While not a single trophy-equipped tank has ever been damaged by an RPG, Russian T-90s have routinely been destroyed by the very ATGMs that its APS is supposed to defend from. Russia's T-90 costs $4.5 million US per tank, while in comparison, the far better performing T-72 only costs around $500,000 to $1 million to produce. That doesn't bode well for Russia's industry, but it might help explain why the T-90 was so late to join the war in significant numbers. Russia's current concerns, though, include finding a way to fix the T-90 in the middle of an active war, as it begins to scrape the bottom of the barrel for Cold War tank reserves. It must also find a way to exit the death spiral it's currently in. In terms of tank crews, Russian tank crews are not being trained well enough for the job and not surviving combat long enough to become veterans and teach a new generation of tankers. Thus, each new tank crew is being trained by less and less experienced teaching staff, ultimately leading to a fatal death cycle. Now, go check out why Russia's failure in Ukraine terrifies China, or click this other video instead.